Welcome back to the Educational Diagnosticians Learning Cohort. This is installment 3 of our series, and today we're going to be talking about some important concepts in educational evaluations, things that we need to know, things that we need to be mindful of, and things that are going to help us do our job well. So we're going to be looking, number one, at informed consent. A lot of diagnosticians are part of those meetings with parents and schools to actually obtain consent for testing. And there's some important concepts around informed consent that are really important to make sure that we're not just getting consent, we are truly getting informed consent. We're also going to look at confidentiality and how that plays into what we do and how we gather information and how we conduct assessments. We'll take a look at the different timelines that are part of our evaluation processes, and then we're also going to talk about some tricks of the trade. So we're going to start with informed consent. And Article 7 tells us that consent is a situation where the parent is fully informed in their native language or other mode of communication about what they're consenting to. It's also important that the parent understands and agrees in writing for whatever it is that we're asking for consent for. So we do have some situations where a parent can tell us something and it's valid, but in a situation that requires informed consent, we're talking about informed written consent so that we have that on paper, we have the data, we have it established and have something to fall back on in case that's ever challenged. It's also important that the parent is fully aware that giving consent is a choice, that it's a voluntary process, and it's also something that they can take back. So if a parent chooses to revoke consent for something that they have previously given consent to, then they can take it back. And that's important to know too. You know, anything that we personally want to agree to, if I know that I can change my mind, then I think that gives just a little bit more power, which is an important part of the process. The parent also does need to know, though, that if they revoke consent, it is not a retroactive thing. It is from the point that the revocation happens forward. So, for example, if a parent has given consent for an evaluation and we do part of that evaluation and then the parent revokes consent, it isn't on us that we've already gotten part of our job done. You know, we had consent at the time that we actually completed those activities. So we've got some different situations where written consent is a requirement. We have to have written consent, and again, it needs to be informed written consent in order to release confidential records outside of the school system. So similar to giving your consent for releasing your medical records from a doctor's office to send them to someone else, except for in those situations where we automatically can share records, such as when a student moves from one school to another, it doesn't take informed written consent, it's just automatic that their educational records will follow. But if we're releasing to someone outside of that scope, we have to have written consent in order to make that happen. We also have to have informed written consent anytime we're beginning an initial evaluation. It's a little different with reevaluations, and we're going to talk about that here in just a minute, but in order to actually start that first evaluation for a student who is not eligible for an IEP yet, we have to have informed written consent. So even if mom is telling me, yes, you have my permission, go ahead, get started, I can't until I have it in writing. We must have informed written consent and actual signature to implement a first IEP. Now, after the parent has consented for an IEP to be put in place, Any IEPs after that have a little bit different rules. So we can get a signature from a parent in order to implement an IEP right away or sooner than a 10-day window after they've gotten a copy of the IEP. Otherwise, if that 10-day window expires, we can go ahead and implement that IEP even without a signature. But for the very first IEP and for implementing other IEPs sooner than letting that period of time elapse where the parent would legally be able to challenge the IEP or ask for adjustments, things like that, we would have to have written consent for that. We need parents' written consent in order to include a representative from a state-operated school as part of the evaluation team. So for example, if we have a student that we suspect would be eligible under the category of blind, low vision, and we would like somebody from the School for the Blind to be part of that evaluation team, then we do need parent written consent in order to make that happen. Now we're going to focus mostly on beginning that initial evaluation piece. We've got a little bit more to talk about with written consent, and then we're going to jump back into really looking at that initial evaluation. So some other times when you need written consent, you have to have written consent before you can access a parent's either public insurance or public benefits for the first time. So for most of us, as we have a new student that comes on to have an IEP that we can bill for Medicaid, we do have to have consent from the parent in order to start that first time of billing for Medicaid. But we don't after that, so it's only that very first time. If we need to exchange records between districts when a student attends a non-public school that's outside of the local district area, we also need consent. So it's kind of a confusing situation, but we have sometimes when we have students who live in our district but attend a non-public school in a neighboring district, and we've got to have some coordination there. We've got to have coordination between the different schools in order to have the data and the records that we need, and we do need written consent when they're outside of our catchment area. Written consent is also required when we want to invite a representative to a meeting that is coming from an outside agency, but that will likely be providing transitions to services for our students in high school. If we need to have those people at the conference, then, and we're doing the inviting, we need to have permission for that to happen. And then we also need written consent from a parent if we want to excuse one of the required case conference committee members from either all or part of a meeting. And we need to do that prior to the conference starting. This is important because we don't want to put parents on the spot. We don't want to ask them as we start a meeting, oh, by the way, the gen ed teacher needs to go back to the class after 20 minutes or so. Is that okay with you? Because most parents are going to feel compelled to say, sure, it's okay, even if they maybe don't believe that's appropriate. Maybe they would like to have them there through the remainder of the meeting. So this does come up as an option as you're creating a notice of conference. It does ask you, is anyone going to need to be excused for all or part of the meeting? And a parent can check the boxes and sign off that this is okay and provide permission. Now, I think for a lot of you, you're probably wondering, okay, well, I maybe don't get all of my notice of conferences back prior to a meeting. It's usually somebody walking in on the day of the meeting saying, oh, I have that paper for you. That's okay, because that's still prior to the meeting beginning, that they've had the notice that you did want to excuse that member. But again, make sure that parents understand that giving that consent is a voluntary process. There's going to be no hard feelings or repercussions if a parent says, no, I don't excuse that person, I need to have them here. And you either can make that happen on the day of the meeting, or you can reschedule the meeting in order to have the right bodies there. But this only applies to those required members, not to other members that tend to come to our conferences but maybe are not on the required list for that particular child. Okay, so let's go back to talking about the exception for a reevaluation. So what the law says is that schools can actually proceed with a reevaluation if the parent doesn't respond to reasonable attempts to get consent. Now, this is different than a parent saying, no, you don't have my permission, because they have clearly said, I don't want this to happen. But if you have sent home this notice and it doesn't come back, and you've had phone calls and the permission doesn't come back, it does allow for schools to proceed with a reevaluation if necessary. But my best guidance I can give you is, do not just do this on your own. Make sure and go through your director of special education and document all of those attempts for getting consent, and let them make the final decision about what to do, because there may be in-house policies or procedures that say we never proceed without consent, and then there may be lots of districts that have a regular practice of getting those reevaluations done when they need the information. Okay, so let's talk about completing those permission forms, whether you're talking about an initial evaluation or a reevaluation. Really, a lot of this information is going to be applicable no matter which ones. So some of you are well versed in completing the evaluation forms, generating those notices. Others of you may not have been part of that in the system, so bear with me if you already know some of this information. So you really need to think first about, what do you actually suspect? So you should already have a great deal of data that got you to this point of saying, we need to test for something, whether it's an initial or whether it's a reevaluation. But you have data to help formulate what it is you're thinking we need to look for, or what questions we need to have answered through the evaluation process. Then we have to think about, okay, well, if we're looking at a particular disability area, we need to think about what is required as well as what else do we need. And again, that falls back to what questions do we have that we need to have answered through the evaluation process. So in the system, with an initial evaluation, when you identify the area of disability that is suspected, or more than one disability area that is suspected, then all of the basic requirements from Article 7 that have to be assessed in some form or fashion automatically get checked by the system, and you cannot uncheck them. And that's a safety net in the system to say, we don't want you to miss something and be out of compliance. So it forces you to have everything on the permission form that would be required. Now, you may have some students that come your way for an evaluation that have already had some outside evaluation, and you're adding to it. So maybe a cognitive assessment is required, but you already have one from a recent evaluation somewhere else that you feel like is valid and giving you good information. And if that is the case, you will still have a cognitive assessment listed on your permission form, but you will be reviewing the data of that instrument that has already come your way as part of the evaluation. So it doesn't mean that we have to necessarily conduct tests in every area that's marked. It means we need to have data in every area that is marked. Now, reevaluations are a little bit different, because reevaluations give us a little more freedom, but it also opens up the door for more error. So you have to be really careful. So when we're thinking about a reevaluation, we kind of need to think about, why are we doing it? Are we just looking for some updated information? Are we thinking that maybe a student no longer qualifies and we need to assess for that? Sometimes we have a student that may potentially qualify in a different area or need a related service, or we may just need information to inform what we're going to do on an IEP, what kind of services the student needs, what kind of supports. So a lot of different things that could be questions that we need to have those answers. And as we identify what areas need to be assessed on the permission forms, we're only going to be checking the areas that are appropriate for the situation. So I think, in a long time ago, and I really do mean a long time ago, there was kind of the mantra that whatever you had to do to test into something, you had to do the exact same things to test out of something. And that really isn't the case legally. It falls back on the professionals on that multidisciplinary team to say, what truly do we need in order to make our case, in order to give us enough data to make good decisions? And so if we have a lot of current data from how students are already doing in the program, how they're doing it in class, how they're doing on other assessments that we have, that's a lot of data right there. I may not need some formal test battery in order to tell me that a student is doing fantastic. One big caution, and that is if we are looking for a different disability area, the system will, when I check a new disability area on the permission form, it will check box all of the things that are required, but it gives me the freedom to uncheck the ones I don't want. It's critical that I don't uncheck things that are required pieces that I don't already have. So for example, if I have a student who is identified as a student with a specific learning disability, and maybe I believe that other health impairment is also appropriate and I want to look at that, and all of the things now get checked for specific learning disability and for other health impairment, and I start looking through my list and say, you know what, I don't think I need a new social and developmental history. Yeah, I'm not really sure that I need a standard classroom observation, and I don't think I need adaptive behavior information. Well, adaptive behavior information is required in order to consider other health impairment, and it was not part of an initial evaluation for a student with specific learning disability. So if I proceed with that evaluation and I have removed that requirement, it's not going to be in compliance. So it is really important that we know exactly what is required for a new area so that we don't remove things that we don't have in existence in the student's file already and that are reasonably current in order for us to make good judgments based on the data that we have. When we complete evaluations, we need to also think about the scope of the evaluation. So we are not really going out on a fishing expedition of let's just test everything and see what bubbles up. But we do have to make sure that our evaluation is broad enough to make sure that if there are red flags out there, if there are areas of need, we will be able to see them. So we don't test so narrowly that we might miss something, but we also don't go really deep into areas that we're not concerned about. So cast your net out there wide enough so that you can get a good aerial view of what's going on with the student. And then we go specific enough into those areas of need to make sure that we, number one, can establish eligibility if that's the question. But number two, we have good data to guide the instructional process for the student after that. Our evaluations are only as good as what they lead to. And I think most of us have gotten really good about completing evaluations that lead to eligibility decisions. But that's only half the battle. After that, it really comes down to, okay, now what? Now what do we do to help the student? My report from the evaluation should be able to guide you as far as what could we write as some potential goals? What kind of services might be appropriate for the student? Not that I'm listing those things necessarily in my report, but there should be some good connectors there that help inform those decisions when the case conference committee meets. Okay, so let's talk about confidentiality, or not talk about confidentiality, right? I mean, we talk a lot at schools, and we are trying to catch teachers and other providers anytime we can to share information. And sometimes that can lead to some issues with confidentiality. So confidentiality is covered in Rule 38 of Article 7, and there's quite a bit of information in there. But it does say that all of the information that comes from assessing a student is part of that child's educational record. And we can share that with people within our system that have legitimate educational interests. So what that means is if I'm part of a 6th grade team and I have a student that has an IEP or has had an evaluation and I feel like I need to see that as the child's teacher, then I should have access to that file. I have legitimate educational interests. There are other teachers that may want to have access to that data. We can share information. But if a kindergarten teacher comes along and says, oh, I had that student when he was in kindergarten, what's going on with him now? That's really not legitimate educational interest. That is more, that's personal concern, but it doesn't fall within that scope of, I can't, as the kindergarten teacher, check out this 6th grader's file and go through it, because I really would not have legitimate interest at that point. It's important as part of confidentiality that we also maintain the dignity of the student. And I think some of this kind of flexes a little bit depending on the age of the student. But it's still important, even with our younger kids, that we protect their interests and that we protect their dignity. So, for example, when a lot of times if I'm going to work with a student, I may go and observe them in class first and very anonymously. And sometimes you do have to work with teachers on this as well, that when I come in, don't point to Johnny and say, there he is back there in the back row in the plaid shirt, because we've really crossed that line of both confidentiality and dignity for the student. So I will come in anonymously and sit down and do my observation before I've met the student. And then if I'm going to work with a student, I don't grab them by the arm and take them out with me, right? You don't march them out. And especially not as students get older and older, they start to make that connection. So for an elementary student, I may, as I'm leaving, give the teacher a Post-it note that says, can you please send Johnny down to the office in 10 minutes? For a high school student, I try to space that out even further so that their peers don't make that connection that some strange lady was in the class and then suddenly this student got called down to the guidance counselor or something like that, because they will make those connections. So again, I try to be very cognizant of that, and I also try to not talk about the evaluation process as we're walking down somewhere. If I'm walking in the hallway with a student, I may say, you know, I'm going to tell you all about what we're doing as soon as we get down here. And I hold the conversation then, or I just make small talk in the hallway. But there are people around, there are people listening, and you really don't need to have everybody else involved in that. It is also important that we realize that that whole legitimate interest circle extends beyond the school. So beyond just who can get into a file, but it's also things like making sure that we're not having a conversation about a student in the teacher's lounge when there are a variety of teachers and sometimes even parent volunteers in there. Sometimes we don't know who all those bodies are that are milling around the school and have access to different places. So making sure to keep those conversations confidential, making sure that we're not going home and sharing confidential information with our family members, because sometimes we have a lot of overlap with our communities. Sometimes we work in areas where we also have our families attending, our kids attending that same school. There are other situations that can be a little trickier. Running into a parent of a student that you work with in the grocery store. You know, if a parent says hi, a student says hi, we say hi, we're human, right? We have that relationship. But I'm not going to have a conversation about where we are in the testing process in the middle of Kroger. I may give the parent my card and say, can you call me on Monday morning and we'll talk about this, or feel free to email me, but you know, I want to protect your child's confidentiality here. It's also important not to share any information related to anything that's going on in the world of special education on Facebook. I have a close friend who does a lot of outside testing and was meeting with people in public locations. And just as a habit, I think a lot of us, we go places and we check in, right? We check in that we're at this restaurant, or we check in that we're at a concert. And she was checking in that working with a client today at this library, which in some small towns now she's probably got 100 people who know you're working with somebody with a disability at this public place and you have completely breached confidentiality. So be very careful with things like that, but also be very careful of friending parents, friending students, things like that can be problematic. Now, somebody had asked the question, okay, well, what if I am already friends with somebody and then suddenly I have a relationship through a professional relationship with their child maybe at school, or I'm part of the testing team? Well, those kind of things happen, and especially in those small communities, they are likely to happen. And we just have to be mindful to keep things professional, to have open discussions about boundaries, to say, you know, I would love to keep in contact with you, but I really need to make sure that we never talk about anything that would cross the line on social media. Some more things related to confidentiality is making sure that we are not including non-essential stuff in our reports. Some of our parents, when they complete forms, or even sometimes our teachers, when they complete forms, give us great information. Some tend to be more guarded and say this is none of your business, and usually when a parent says that, I tend to agree. That I understand why they wouldn't have wanted to answer a question. But I also have times when parents may share with us a great deal of information that is kind of juicy gossip that was really interesting to read, but that is not necessarily relevant to anything that I am evaluating for. So I try to leave out any of that non-essential stuff. For example, I recently had a student that the parent had shared just interesting things, I guess, that a student was born with several teeth already in when they were first born. And it's the kind of thing that you read and think, that's kind of interesting, but does anybody else need to know that? Is this going to embarrass this kid when somebody reads their report and thinks, well, that is really odd? We get a lot of parents that may report things like well, my brother-in-law is in jail for drug charges or something like that. If it's relevant that this is maybe causing emotional distress for the child, it could be a relevant thing. But you may guard it a little more by saying there's some, family member that is incarcerated, but I'm not giving the details on, that Uncle so-and-so is in jail for cocaine possession, because it really is nobody's business. And we want to make sure that we're protecting that dignity of the child at all costs and of the family. They may share a lot of things that they hope that it might help you know a little bit more, but not necessarily that they want everybody who ever sees this report until the student is graduating from high school. Not everybody needs to know that kind of stuff. A couple of exceptions to confidentiality. We are mandatory reporters. So we have a couple of situations that are very important. One is that duty to warn. So if a student expresses suicidal tendencies, suicidal thoughts, anything like that, talks to you about any sort of intent to either harm themselves or is actively talking about intent to harm someone else, then we have to break confidentiality and we have to report this. We have to let somebody know to make sure that either that child is safe or the person that they may be targeting is safe. We also are required to report any suspicion of abuse or neglect. We report it, we don't investigate it, and do not investigate it. If a child tells you something, you make sure and report that to the proper authorities right away, but you don't ask for lots of information. That's somebody else's job, and we may kind of spoil a future interview if we start asking too many questions. Okay, on to some timelines. So when we're thinking about timelines for the different evaluations, we have to know, number one, what timeline am I actually working on? And then think about some of those situations where maybe we've come down to the wire of almost missing a deadline, or maybe we have missed deadlines. Probably a lot of you out there have had one or more cases in the past where you have missed a timeline for an initial evaluation or for a reevaluation. But we also want to make sure that not only are we doing things on time, but we're doing it in a compliant way. So we don't want to rush and get through things and check off the boxes, but then our evaluation is really useless. It has to be compliant as well as it has to be on time. In figuring out what timeline that we're on, we look to Article 7. It tells us the different situations that can result in different timelines. For our standard initial evaluation, our state law requires that we complete those evaluations and hold a case conference meeting within 50 instructional days of when the parent written consent is received. Okay, so there are a couple of key things in there. One is that we're talking about instructional days, so days that school was actually in session. I know it's a little different for us now because there are some days that we are holding continuous learning, that we are in session even though we're not in the building, and those days actually do count. Days that are used such as waiver days, weekends, holidays, spring break, things like that do not count. Snow days, if we're off for a snow day and we did not have e-learning, then that would also be an instructional day. So 50 instructional days, and it's from when the consent is received by the parent, which means it's not necessarily always going to be the day that is marked on the date. I don't know about you, but I tend to have a lot of forms that come into my house and I act on them quickly. I sign them and I set them on the kitchen table, and they sit there and they sit there, and I maybe get around to mailing something in a week or two later. And I think a lot of times we get consent forms that may be marked as signed on the 10th, but we didn't receive it until the 24th. It's the date that licensed personnel receives the consent that starts the clock for this evaluation, to give us the benefit of the doubt and the benefit of enough days to do a really good evaluation. So it's important that whoever might be receiving that paperwork actually writes somewhere on there, received on this date, stamps it with a receipt stamper, whatever it is that you have available, but that you document that so that the proper timeline is generated. There are some exceptions to this 50 instructional day rule. So the first exception is when a student has participated in a process that assesses the student's response to scientific research-based interventions, then the time frame is 20 instructional days. Now that kind of leaves us to figuring out a lot of stuff here. We have some kids that participate in some interventions, but we really haven't completed them. We really haven't had students show us or give us any progress monitoring data from the process. We haven't collected that. Maybe we have said, we really expect a student to participate in something for this many weeks and we expect to see a certain amount of progress, and we've either made that kind of progress or maybe we have not participated that whole length of time. So it's kind of questionable for a lot of students exactly whether they fall into this category or not. And I would encourage you to fall back on some local guidance for that to see how your intervention process is actually set up and working. You may not have students that fit into this category, but others of you may have. So 20 days for that case. The next exception is when a student has been in first steps. So when they have been part of Part C interventions in early childhood and they are transitioning up to that preschool level, then the law says that we need to do the evaluation and hold a conference to make sure that any services that are needed are there and waiting for when the child turns 3. And the purpose of that is to make sure that there is a smooth transition with no delay in services between a kid who's getting those first step services and a kid who needs preschool. So that could give us a longer period of time from when we kind of get the ball rolling there, but it also could give us a very short window of time if we don't have really good structured communication between the first steps representatives in our area and our preschool evaluation team. The third exception is one that's really applying to a lot of us right now. It says when a parent of a student repeatedly fails to or refuses to produce the student for an evaluation, then the timeline may not be met. Well, right now, it's not necessarily that any parent is refusing, but parents are failing to produce the student because schools are closed and we just don't have access to them. So in this case, we have a lot of situations where we are not able to meet those timelines because of this situation, that we are basically on lockdown and we can't violate that for non-essential activity. It's not a crisis situation that would require us to have a student be produced for face-to-face kind of testing. And there's a lot of our assessment that cannot be done unless we are actually with the student or being able to observe a student in a classroom setting or a typical setting for them. So that global pandemic situation doesn't really fall in any drop-down menu that we ever see for missing timelines, but it really is applying to us right now. Okay, situation 4 is our kiddos who move. So sometimes the student may be in the process of an evaluation. We've either we've started it or we've at least gotten permission signed and the student moves. So what it basically says is we need to talk. We need to figure out, can we meet by that original deadline, or do we need to negotiate a new timeline for the student? I've had situations where a student has moved in and there's 1 day left before the original deadline. And sometimes all the testing is done and all we need to do is conference. There are other times where I've had students move in, we've had very few days left, and nothing has been done yet. And you've got a whole new batch of teachers who are going to have a hard time filling out a rating scale on a student because they just met the student. So in that case, we may negotiate a new timeline. So sometimes when you can meet that original deadline and sometimes when you can't. And then finally, if a student is referred for an initial educational evaluation during a time period where they are either suspended, expelled, or they're in an interim alternative setting, then the timeline reverts to 20 instructional days. It means the situation is serious. The student is probably not receiving instruction or is receiving it very differently, and we need to figure out what's going on. If we do not yet have an understanding of whether the student has a disability, because this would be only in those cases of initial evaluation, not for any reevaluations. Okay, now we're going to look at reevaluation timelines. So we've got 3 different potential categories for a reevaluation, and they do have different timelines. So if we're just wanting to either reestablish eligibility or a related service, that we need some updated information, we just want to make sure you still qualify, or maybe we think you don't qualify. In those cases, that we have to have that evaluation completed by the next annual case conference meeting. So we could get a permission sign and we have our next ACR next month. Or we could get a permission signed at an annual case review and have to meet by the next year. So really think about, though, what are the implications of waiting to not meet? We do have that stretch of time, but is it just for updated information, or is it going to change potentially what we do for a student? And if so, we probably want to meet a lot sooner than that next annual case conference. If we want to determine eligibility in a different category or a different related service, or an additional area, then we need to complete that evaluation and meet within 50 instructional days, 50 school days. And by the same token, if we need reevaluation information in order to basically tell us what do we need to do here to inform the committee of what the student's needs are, whether those needs are things like assistive technology or maybe a related service, then we need to meet within 50 instructional days, because we're basically saying, I need more data in order to know what to do to support the student, and we don't want to wait until the next year to do that. So those are 3 different timelines for a reevaluation, and it's really important that we select the appropriate one in the system, because again, it will drive that internal timeline that gets generated by the Indiana IEP system. So some common issues that we tend to have with timelines, things that can push us up against that deadline or sometimes have us fail to meet the deadline. Scheduling conflicts, whether it's scheduling a case conference, scheduling time to meet with a student. For those of you who are testing high school kiddos, always check to see whether they go to maybe a career center. That can really shorten your window of opportunity for getting to meet with the student. So think ahead for those kinds of things. Excessive caseloads. When you've got 15 other kids to test before this one, they kind of get pushed back further and further. because you're always trying to meet those deadlines. When we do an evaluation for a student, it is always as part of a multidisciplinary team. Team is a key word here. We have to work together. And in working together, it's important that we're all committing to getting this done on time. So whoever is going to be responsible for kind of the final cleanup of a report and making sure a meeting gets set is going to need to have information from those team members in plenty of time to make all that happen. So if there's a late report from one team member and it's holding up the whole process, it could potentially put your timeline in jeopardy. There can be a lot of difficulty getting medical records when you need them. Medical information, certification from a doctor, a vision evaluation from an ophthalmologist, whatever it is that's needed, we need to have as quickly as possible because it can really drive what we do with some of the rest of the evaluation. And there are some offices that I think probably some of you have gotten good relationships with, maybe the front office staff or the records department, and you can get things very quickly. And others that you may send off a permission form and are waiting weeks and weeks and still not seeing anything. So that can sometimes get in the way. Difficulty getting a hold of the parents. I have found that I can call and call and call and get no one, but if I send a text, I get an immediate response. So there are a lot of different apps that are available to you to be able to send a text through the computer system so that nobody is getting your personal cell phone information, but you're much more likely to have a parent respond to a text than you are to actually answering a phone call. Cancellation of meetings. Waiting until the last minute for a meeting and then having a parent cancel or ask for things to be rescheduled, or a global pandemic that says, by the way, we can't meet on that date because we aren't in school anymore. Things like that can get in the way of our timelines. Students moving, transferring between different schools, and then student absences can be a big factor. So in a situation where a student's attendance is poor, sometimes you try to go and work with a student 10 different times before you actually get to see them, and your schedule is already limited, and everybody else is also trying to work with the student. That can really get in the way of things. So I'm in a strict habit of, before I drive to some place to work with a student, I call and make sure they actually showed up for the day so that I'm not wasting time going back and forth to buildings where a student is not present. Okay, so some tips for meeting timelines, and some of these are kind of implied, and some of these we've already talked about a little bit. Number one, make sure that you note the date received of a consent form, not the date signed. Getting as much stuff completed at that initial referral meeting as possible can really help your timelines. A lot of timelines are kind of destroyed by just trying to hunt down all the forms you need to make an evaluation compliant, to make sure that all your pieces and parts are there and that you've gathered all the information needed. So getting things like the social and developmental history completed right there at that first meeting, seeing if a parent can stay an extra 20 minutes, or completing it with them. They talk and you write. That can really help things. Also making sure that you're bringing any potential rating scales with you and distribute them on day 0. If you can do that right when you get consent, you are saving yourself a ton of time for getting this information and really having a good write-up in your report. It's also possible to go ahead and set at least a tentative case conference date when you get that initial referral and get the paperwork signed for consent for testing. you're more likely to have an opening that far down the road. And if you get done sooner and can arrange a sooner meeting, great. But if you can arrange something for, a week before your ultimate deadline, then you're more likely to make sure that all of that information gets done and hold the meeting on time. Put deadlines on rating scales. If I don't know when something is due, I may choose to put it off for a while. But if you can put deadlines, that can be really helpful as well. Make sure and notify everybody who's on the M team. Your entire multidisciplinary team is not likely to be at a referral meeting, but if whoever is putting that team together and identifying who are the people who are going to be involved in this evaluation, we need to make sure and let them know and give them the benefit of that full 50 instructional days from when the consent gets signed. So notification process of some kind, and especially in thinking about your occupational therapist, your speech pathologist that just may not even hear about a case until you let them know. Very, very important. Keep a running record of when things are done. And you could do this through a Google form or any other method, but it's always important to me to know when the academic testing is done, because I would like to know more about the results of that prior to doing some of the assessments that I do with students. And if I know when they are when that diagnostician maybe is going to be working with a student, it can change when I plan to go meet with a student as well. Give the rest of your team some deadlines too. I really need to have your part of the educational evaluation report done by this date, because we have to kind of always back things up and say, okay, I know when my due date is, which means 5 days before that I need to have the notice of initial findings out to a parent, which means I have to know what those findings are. So, I mean, we're really never working, or shouldn't be working, at day 50 on any of our write-up, because some of our deadlines fall before that meeting date deadline. Build some writing time into your schedule and build it in on a regular basis. And sometimes that's hard to stick to, but it is important to get the best information that you can. A lot of you have big caseloads. You have a lot of kids, and they start to blend together when you test too many kids in any given week, and you start to write them up and think, okay, wait, is Johnny the little blonde kid? Wait, I don't remember. And you lose a lot of the richness that can be in reports of the funny things that they said, the stories that you can tell to really help a parent understand that you actually got a glimpse of their kid. Those kinds of things are important, but if you don't space out that writing time so that you get that important information in promptly, you may lose some of it. Also, making sure that we get those meetings in on time. So if it came down to the wire and a parent didn't come for that initial meeting, you really should go ahead and hold that meeting. But you must be open to then also meeting again with the parent to make sure that they have every opportunity to be part of that case conference committee and to really make good decisions. So, there are times when you really are just down to the wire, and I just explained to parents, well, we absolutely have to meet by this date. I understand there's no possible way for you to do it. I'd like to have some input from you. I want to include that. We're going to do the best we can, and then we are more than willing to meet again and to have you be part of that meeting. But we need to get that first one in to satisfy that timeline requirement. And number 10 is take care of yourself. And I mean that in a very honest way, that when we get way overstressed and all we're thinking about is timelines and how can I manage all of this, our health tends to go downhill. So if we don't also make sure and take some time for ourselves and take at least one night a week that you're not writing reports in the evening, then you're going to get sick more, And when you're sick more, that means you can't meet timelines as well because you're missing out on a lot of those different opportunities. So just some self-care is important. So a couple of tricks of the trade before we close on this one. When it's possible, try to schedule your testing time, your evaluation time ahead of time with the teacher. Most teachers are pretty good about just letting you come and talk to them and say, do you mind if I pull this kiddo today to work with them? But sometimes you run up against those fun projects that they're doing in class. You run up against something that they really feel like the student needs to be in class for. It just maybe throws them for a loop when you just show up. It's not always possible. Sometimes we are at a building and we are just finding the bodies that we can on that day in order to get as many students into that rotation as we can. But again, when possible, try to contact the teacher. Also, when possible, letting the parents know ahead of time. Parents do appreciate just having a sense of when do you plan to work with their child. Now, sometimes that can backfire. Sometimes we have parents that will say, can you please let me know when you're going to test because I don't want my child to be on their medication that day. And that's not really giving us good information. But for the most part, I think parents understand that they need to have some peace of mind of what's happening. But for some of our kids, they need to do a little prepping with our kids. I try not to let parents know when I'm going to be observing at school because I really want to be incognito. I don't want the student to be aware that somebody is coming to class to watch you. And if I do speak to parents in advance, I will tell them, please don't talk to your child about this part. You can talk to them about they're going to be working with some people coming up soon. They're going to be, finding out how they learn and things that can help them and things like that. But not talking about somebody's going to be watching you in class because they'll be on the lookout for that, and it can really alter what we see in the classroom. Use a scheduling form when you can to coordinate who is going to be doing what and who's going to be working with the student when. You don't want to show up and be scheduled for testing in the afternoon with a student and have the student tell you, oh, I worked all morning on the other stuff. I worked with that different person, because that's not going to be good information. Call ahead to make sure the student actually showed up for the day. That's an important rule. Break up testing sessions either when you need to, when you can, because of the student's age or attention span, and also when permissible by the test, because there are certain parts of tests that you can't break up because there is a time span that happens from one sub-test to the next. But most things you could break into parts, and sometimes that's really needed. Using visual schedules or checkoff sheets with students can also be helpful, because some of our kids want to know, how much of this do I have to do? How many things do I have to get through? So using a visual schedule of some sort, or some kind of visual for the student to have to know, I started here and I'm ending here. But also treats, and I use treats for students. I use treats sometimes to get rating scales back. I sometimes use treats for students when you're talking about, can you get this form back from your mom tomorrow, because I really, really need it. And if you do, I'm going to have a prize waiting for you. Bribery, yes, but it works. So I am all in favor of having treats. But I am also very conscious that we've got kids with allergies. So typically I tend to bring chocolate. I also tend to bring gummies, because a lot of our kids who can't have chocolate or don't like it will like gummies. And then I bring pencils too, because there are some kids that you may know in advance don't use food as any sort of incentive. So I want to have some different options for that. So Some of the things that you can do as far as using those different schedules, these are just some visuals that you can see. So you may have different parts of the evaluation that as you complete a different subtest, you mark it off, and you can kind of change these as you need to. For some of our younger kids, you may use this kind of a visual. This is just a random one showing them some things are reading, some are math, some are writing. It's always good to know when you're done and when you'll get some sort of reward. And if you're going to need a break somewhere in there, it's good to show them where we're going to have break time. Other kids, you may just say, we will take a break whenever you need to take a break, and that's okay. And then for some kids, you can also use more of a game board kind of procedure. We're going to start here and we're going to follow the pathway, and once we get through all the blocks, then we're done. And at the end of the game is some kind of reward. Well, thank you for joining us for important concepts in educational evaluations. And we'll be adding more to this series, and we hope that you'll join us for some of the future topics. Thank you.